So with that, I'm thrilled to hand over to Meg. Margaret Green is the head of Greenworks, and she's a senior fellow at Equimundo and has led our work on this topic. And she's been also one of the co-creators of Equimundo back when we started. Meg, I'm happy to hand it over to you, and welcome to all the rest of our speakers, and thanks to all the participants who are joining us. I'll just see if there's any logistics issues, but I think we're all okay. Okay, great. Meg, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. Welcome, everybody. I'm extremely happy to be moderating this first webinar as part of the Global Boyhood Initiative series. I'm really pleased and proud to participate in this quite comprehensive lineup of topics relating to boys and child early and forced marriages and unions, and a stellar set of researchers and advocates in this area. Reference to and research on boys and child marriage appear here and there, but it's a comparatively rare focus. And this just doesn't make sense given that traditional marriage involves males and females, and that norms are systems of beliefs and values that have implications for everyone in society. So if we're keen to shift norms to open up possibilities for girls who are more likely to marry very early, we've got to be working with boys and men and masculinities as well. So today's webinar will take us surfing across a comprehensive set of research areas. We're going to hear about gender transformative interventions to engage men and boys in efforts to prevent child marriage, the big issues in the data on boys and child marriage. We'll learn how Girls Not Brides member organizations are thinking about norms and masculinities. We'll hear about how gender-related factors can push boys themselves to marry early, and we'll hear about challenges in the field and the role that United Nations agencies can play in addressing these issues. Throughout the webinar, please drop questions into the chat. We want this to be as interactive as possible. And the way that so I've mentioned those different topics. We're going to have short remarks from each of our speakers, so that we're very much focused on the whole panel and the interaction between the different contributions to the panel. So let me give you a very brief introduction to the researchers you're going to be hearing from today. First, Julie Rialet, consultant to Equimundo for this research, is a Paris-based professional supporting international and local NGOs to use evidence to create strategies for social impact. She worked previously with Girls Not Brides, Tostan International, and Terre des Hommes. And in 2021, together with Giovanna Lauro and me, she led Equimundo's review and analysis of gender transformative interventions to engage men and boys in efforts to prevent child marriage, with support from UNFPA. Colleen Murray-Gaston is a statistics specialist responsible for data analysis and global monitoring of harmful practices at UNICEF. Her work focuses on analyzing levels, trends, and disparities in child marriage and female genital mutilation, including for global reporting on progress toward international targets such as the elimination of harmful practices as set out in the Sustainable Development Goals. Then we have Jean Casey, who works with Girls Not Brides as the research and humanitarian manager. She leads on the Child Marriage Research Action Network, the CRANK, which I hope you are familiar with. And she's responsible for supporting a coordinated global learning agenda on child marriage and on strengthening the uptake of the latest child marriage evidence by practitioners, advocates, and policymakers. Then we have Dr. Jeffrey Edmeades, with whom I've had the pleasure of working for some years now. And we've long shared an interest in making the roles of boys and men more visible in data and analyses. He is currently serving as a senior demographic and health research analyst at Avenir Health and the Demographic and Health Surveys program. He previously founded and led Demographics, an independent consulting firm, providing research services to public health and international development clients globally, and also was a senior social demographer at the International Center for Research on Women. And finally, we have Jose Roberto Luna Manzanero, with whom I've also had the good fortune of collaborating over a number of years. He's a technical specialist on adolescents and youth and child marriage in the technical division of UNFPA headquarters. He provides technical and programmatic support to the countries and regions working under the UNFPA UNICEF Global Program to End Child Marriage, where he leads the work on gender transformative approaches and promoting positive masculinities. So you can see how this set of presentations really takes on the issues of boys and child marriage from lots of different angles. And I think we'll have a wonderful conversation today. So to lead us off, I would like to ask, well, I guess first, yes, I'd like to ask Julie to give us some of the top messages that emerged from Equimundo's review and analysis of gender transformative interventions to engage men and boys in the prevention of child marriage. And I believe that there are a couple of slides that will be shared now.
Should I go ahead and share my screen, Meg?
That would be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Feel free to call me out if I take too long, because I think I always get confused with slideshow, but I think once it's on, I can no longer see the chat. Sorry, just a minute. Okay. Can you all see my screen? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks so much for the introduction, Meg. And really happy to be here and having the opportunity to share some of the insights that from this research that we've been working on with Equimundo. So I'll probably just provide a quick word of introduction about this piece of work, just to say that what we did there was to first select and organize kind of the existing evidence on the root causes of child marriage to help understand and make the case why gender transformative engagement of boys and men is important to address the issue, and then reviewed selection of current efforts to try and draw out some of the existing trends in program strategies, identifying strengths and gaps, to then formulate some recommendations for practitioners. So there's a number of key themes that emerge from the program review. And to jump right in, the first one was that actually there were, you mentioned that, Meg, in your introduction, there are not so many well-documented initiatives that specifically engage boys and men to advance gender equality and address child marriage, but they do exist. So that was good news for us. And I think one point that is worth reminding is that this review was not a systematic review, and we really tried to make the most of what existed and not limit ourselves to rigorously evaluated interventions. So with this in mind, we selected 26 sets of intervention, and to highlight a few examples, it's quite hard to, I don't really have the time to run through them all, but there was quite a good comprehensive set of intervention across South Asia and Africa mainly that came up with some programs working at scales and promoting gender equitable attitudes among girls and boys through schools, like programs like the GEMS program or Taron Kitoli. We had quite a few programs that had developed specific curricula tailored to the needs of adolescent boys, like the one of Equal Community Foundation or Plan International Champions of Change, for example, showing promising results. And then we also had obviously some interventions focusing on not only the prevention, but addressing some of the consequences of child marriage. So programs like the REAL program or Club des Maris in the Sahel and Uganda that were really trying to empower husbands and partners. One key gap that we found was that none of the programs that came up were focusing on child grooms. So that was something to flag. In terms of the overview of programs reviewed, a key findings was also that the institutional level investment was limited. We found that most of the intervention focused at the individual, family, or community level, which is obviously very important. But the reason why we flagged this gap as particularly important is linked to some of the framing that we've made in the report. And Gary and Meg briefly touched on this in the introduction, but trying to summarize some very rich contents was very linked to the central role of patriarchy in driving and sustaining child marriage, and the need to address some of the restrictive definition of masculinity and femininity and unequal power relations that get transmitted through socialization, but also very much embedded in institutions in society. So that was quite a big gap. But while there was this gap coming up, it was quite good to see that there was solid solid work happening at the individual and family level, with some majority of the intervention covering topics that are essential for the gender transformative journey. So just to cite a few examples of this, as I just mentioned, patriarchy, gender, power, transition from boyhood to manhood, the impact of all of this on the gender distribution of responsibilities, topics like SRHR for married and unmarried adolescents. So quite a good coverage there. There's a but. The but was more to do around sexuality, the topic of sexuality and reaching consensus. What we found is that sexuality was not covered in depth enough, that because of what we just mentioned with the central role of patriarchy. One thing to add is that the control of girls' and women's sexuality is very central when it comes to child marriage, and especially notions of purity, preserving girls' virginity before marriage to find a suitable husband, notions of family honor. So this type of things, and also the misconception associated with boys and girls' sexuality, we found that most intervention didn't go to that level of details when it came to this topic, and would rather focus a bit more on topics like bodily changes or family planning. So there were more efforts to do there. And we also found that while there was some consensus around the topics covered through the interventions, it was more difficult to identify consensus around the practicalities of program implementation. So things like the length of programs or the frequency of the sessions, for example. But I think that one consensus that came out was a broader engagement on the need for long-term and deeper engagement when it comes to gender transformative initiatives. including for staff. So that probably doesn't come as a surprise. I'm sure it echoes a lot of the evidence that exists on child marriage and broader literature on gender behavioral change. But yeah, one point that came out particularly strong was the value of gender transformative staff training to avoid reproducing some of the harmful gender norms and power dynamics.
Julie,
Yes.
we've given you no time at all to talk about a huge report. And I just wanted to be conscious of the time. If you could kind of summarize the next slide or so, that would be very helpful.
Absolutely. Actually, some of those last points about the need for contextual programming, program design, and qualitative evaluation, I'll probably have an opportunity to mention them later. So just very important points about contextualization, which also doesn't really come as a surprise. And the point of program evaluation was there was a particular lack of consistency in the type of outcome measures, the quality and availability of programming, of evaluation. So I'll just stop there. I think the next slides were just to kind of give a teaser to participants in the webinar to see the kind of details that they can find in the report, some of the issues that came up as covered in the interventions. You can find some boxes like this ones that bring up some of the analysis and mention specific programs across the board. And then you can have a broader look at all the interventions that we reviewed. And if you want more details about each intervention, you can see in Annex B, it's a very long annex, but very useful as well, program descriptions and some very useful links as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, so it's a very rich report with a lot of detail in it. And thank you, Julie, for doing such a good job of just sort of laying out what's some of the material that's in there. Next, I'd like to turn to Colleen and ask you if you could please give us an overview of the data that's available on boys and child marriage and what you see as the big issues in this space.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I believe there should be some slides that can go up. Terrific. Thank you so much. So I'd like to take a couple of minutes and give a bit of a global overview here of the practice in terms of just what we see in the data. So in the course of a handful of slides and charts, we'll look at how common the practice is worldwide, where in the world it's most common, and then look at some patterns in comparison to what we see with child marriage among girls. Slide, please. Thanks. So just to start off, when we ask about how common is child marriage among boys, I just want to start by being clear about how we're defining it for the sake of this conversation in particular, or for the sake of at least my presentation of the data. So for the global analysis, we take the same approach in defining child marriage for boys as for girls. And the reason for this is that as a rights violation, there's not a distinction where the marriage of a child is only a violation if the child is a girl. So the same considerations that we take in defining child marriage among girls, for example, that it can be a formal marriage or an informal cohabiting union, we apply that same definition for boys as well for the sake of the analysis. We also use the same age threshold of 18 years as a kind of generally comparable convention about the age of majority. So here in this presentation, when we're talking about child marriage among boys or talking about child grooms, the measure that we're using is going to be this standard indicator that's the analog of the global monitoring indicator for the SDG on child marriage among girls, but the male version of it. So what we'll be looking at is the percentage of young men aged 20 to 24 years who were first married or in union by age 18. Before we go on, I just want to add as a caveat that, of course, legislation kind of varies across countries, both in terms of what is the precise age of majority, as well as what's the minimum, legal age of marriage for boys versus girls. So here, we're using a standard definition for the sake of, a global analysis, but of course there are going to be particular concerns about the definitions in different countries. Slide, please. Okay, so to begin with a big picture view here, we see in the data evidence that child marriage among boys exists to varying degrees in countries around the world. The analysis we're showing here is based on 108 countries around the world with data that represent 61% of boys in the world in these countries with data. You'll see that the global level of child marriage among boys sits right now at about 3%. And we see higher levels of child marriage among boys in the least developed countries, for example, where it reaches a bit above 5%. And then across geographic regions, there's a bit of variation. We see, for example, in aggregate, the highest levels in Latin America and the Caribbean and Eastern and Southern Africa. Again, we're talking about 5 or 6% on an aggregate scale, with sort of lower levels in the Asian regions and less in Middle East and North Africa. It's important to note here that some of these regional estimates are more stable, I would say, than others based on the data. So we have reasonable data coverage in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, for example. So those are pretty solid estimates, but you'll see in the chart here that we have a bit less data on countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, Middle East and North Africa. So these are not representative of the regions. It's just a summary of the data that we have at the moment. Next slide, please. So shifting from this global and regional view into now a look at individual countries, something that emerges that's a bit, I think, interesting in the data is the countries in which child marriage among boys is most common are quite diverse. They're not, clustered around the world in a certain place in the world. So when we're looking at the geographic regions of the world, of the 7, regions with data, 5 of those regions include countries both below the 20th percentile and above the 80th percentile. So each of the regions has quite a large spread. There's really not a lot of, kind of clustering around the mean. Let me show you what I mean in the next slide. So here you'll see we've shifted to a country level view. So in this view, we're looking at the same measure of child marriage prevalence, marriage by 18 among boys. Each dot in the chart represents one country, and they're clustered in these verticals by region. So we can see that on the left-hand side in the Middle East and North Africa, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, we're seeing all of the countries are below 5% prevalence. But for the remaining regions, for a practice that's kind of globally at a 3% prevalence, this is quite a wide spread that we're seeing in the experience of different countries within the region. So, I mean, in particular, Latin America and Caribbean, both of the Sub-Saharan African regions, the fact that the levels really spread from 0% to 15 or so is a bit unusual, I would say. And it's not even necessarily a matter of having a single outlier that's very high or very low. It's really it's a pretty consistent spread, with the exception of these couple especially high levels in Latin America and the Caribbean and West and Central Africa. Next slide, please. So one other reflection about the levels that we see is that the countries in which child marriage for boys is most common are disparate from one another, but they're also disparate from the countries where the practice is most common for girls, which I think is interesting. So for boys, and we'll look at the list of the top countries, but for boys, for example, the top 10 countries in terms of prevalence are spread across 5 different geographic regions. So they're in Africa, they're in Latin America, they're in the Pacific, they're not clustered. And this is quite different from the pattern that we see among girls, where all of the top 10 countries and 17 of the top 20 countries are all in Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. And I can show you this in a map in the next slide quickly. So here we have just a list of these are the top 20 countries in the world for child marriage levels among boys. We'll see there are about 13 countries now where the prevalence of child marriage is 10% or higher, with a couple of countries reaching 20%. And again, they're spread, geographically around the world. Not a ton that we can say about a geographic pattern there. And then to conclude, I just wanted to give kind of, we have a short amount of time, but just a little bit of rapid fire additional findings that we see in the data. So a couple of key points. One is that while we see that the geographic profile of where child marriage is most common is, quite different from girls, in terms of the individual boys who are most at risk within countries, that profile is quite similar to what we see for girls. So they tend to be the ones from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So we see higher prevalence in those from the poorest households, in rural areas with no education or only primary schooling. So that type of socioeconomic profile is sort of what we might expect, I guess. The next point is that the practice is declining. So it's become less common kind of in the long-term sense across generations. One point that we were particularly interested in looking at in the analysis is about who are child grooms marrying. So what we find is that child grooms are most often married to child brides. So in all the countries with data, the majority of child grooms were married to child brides, and in most cases, it was about 70% or more. And then last, just a quick insight is that we looked a bit at reproductive health outcomes and a few other outcomes for child grooms, and found a handful of things that offer some reason for concern. For example, we see that child grooms are less likely than their peers to have comprehensive knowledge of HIV. We also see some issues around around fatherhood. So they tend to start their families quite early, have a large number of children at a young age, and then kind of in their lifespan tend to exceed their desired family size more so than their peers who marry later. And as we conclude, I just have, I think, one last chart to illustrate. Yes, this is the illustration of the child brides and child grooms together. So here we're seeing that the wives of child grooms tend to be very young, often below 15. So this is data from a few years ago, so we can just take it as illustrative. But for example, we can see that this entire blue portion of each of these bars is the share of child grooms' wives who are under 18, with the dark blue being the portion who are under 15. So we can see that it's quite common for these partnerships to be marriages in which both the husband and wife are children. And with that, I'll wrap up for now. Again, thanks so much.
Thank you, Colleen. And I think I speak for many of us when I say I think we're quite hungry for data on the experience of boys. So thank you for presenting such an interesting analysis. And I know that the other forthcoming presentations will connect to some of the themes that you've raised. So given these interesting patterns, I know that some of the partners of Girls Not Brides are starting to address the role of boys and, the need to look at masculinities. And I would like to invite Jean Casey now to share a few observations about some of that work. Thank you, Jean.
Hi, Meg, and everyone. Thanks so much for the invite to share the insights from Girls Not Brides today, and on behalf of the Crank Network. I think I've shared some slides there, if we can pop them up, and I've just realized my dog is snoring very loudly in the background, so I'm hoping you can't hear him. So yes, next slide, please. Yeah, so we know from the evidence base that discriminatory social norms, including negative masculinities, are powerful drivers of child marriage and many other forms of gender inequality. In response to this, the global membership, which consists of 1,600 members across regions, are working on multi-levels to dismantle patriarchal systems and transform harmful gender norms and practices in order to create the conditions for girls in all their diversity to exercise their social, political, and economic rights, including live free from child marriage and other forms of violence. And we see this commitment to increased emphasis on working with men and boys in the refresh of the Girls Not Brides theory of change, which I'll go on to in the next slide, please. So just some background on this. This was a refresh that we conducted in 2020. It involved consultation with over 300 members where they contributed their experiences and perspectives to inform the shifts and changes in this refresh. It was a deep consultation, as I mentioned, and it resulted in a clear articulation for an increased focus on working with men and boys, as well as religious and traditional leaders across all levels of the theory of change. Some of the key shifts proposed by members align with a more significant focus on tackling discriminatory social norms and negative masculinities under the families and community pillars, alongside strengthening a rights-based approach across the whole of the theory of change, and with a greater emphasis on the role of national level CSOs working collectively to advocate for gender equitable services, policies, and laws. And I'll just give an example of how this is informing our members' work. If you want to move on to the next slide, please. So here we're seeing this strengthened focus on transforming discriminatory social norms and negative masculinities. In this example from a Girls Not Brides member, Kisha Kishani, in collaboration with Project Kel. And this example outlines a combined individual and community-based approach to addressing social norms, using storytelling as a change medium to challenge concepts and structures that lead to child marriage and promote gender equitable attitudes and actions. The images from the curricula and collection of stories are importantly by youth, they're written by youth for youth, and aim to connect boys and men with the ways they embody and practice negative masculinities that discriminate against girls and perpetuate patriarchal, I can't pronounce that all of a sudden, control of assets, opportunities, and powers. Next slide, please. The second example we feature here is the Yo Quiero, Yo Puedo program from Mexico, which I'm sure lots of people have come across previously. This is a gender transformative community and systems-based approach, which includes working with boys, girls, families, communities, and authorities at municipal and state levels, including governments and civil society. And key features to this approach include employing a rights-based approach to gender equality and sexuality education through the implementation of a gender transformative comprehensive sexuality curricula in schools. And this is accompanied by community workshops where messages around sexuality, gender, and child marriage were integrated into the workshops to support and importantly, sustain the behavioral change. And building on the early successes of Yo Quiero, Yo Puedo, they're now strengthening relationships with the municipal and the state education sector with the aim of scaling up and advocating for improved delivery of health, education, and other public services within municipal, state, and federal governments. So it's just like a snapshot on some of the ways that we're seeing members incorporate and promote the work of men and boys across gender to work towards gender equality. And I think I shared a report which is called Tackling the Taboo. So I think that might be shared in the chat as well. So back over to you. Thanks, Meg.
Thanks very much. It's very interesting to hear how a couple of organizations have taken on this challenge, and you see resonance with the review that Julie presented and some of the general themes that this work requires touching on. Next, I'd like to ask Jeff Edmeades to talk about some of the gender-driven pressures that lead boys to marry early. And I think that given the data that Colleen presented, what Jeff has to share will be we're primed to hear what you have to say, Jeff. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Meg. No, I really think it's important to really acknowledge the work that Colleen has done and that UNICEF broadly has done in this area, because there's so little attention to the issue of child marriage among boys, and really I think their work has been at the forefront of raising this as a legitimate issue for us to look at. In thinking about going beyond simply being able to document the prevalence of child marriage among boys, we really wanted to begin to think a bit more about what the key drivers of child marriage might be for boys. It's pretty clear that these drivers are different for boys than they are for girls, even in contexts where early family formation is the norm. Both are obviously influenced by common factors such as poverty, unintended pregnancy, and rural residence, among other structural factors. But the relationship between each of these factors and early marriage for boys tends to be a bit weaker than it is for girls. And they're, it's somewhat missing a little bit of the common explanations that we might typically expect when looking at child marriage for girls. So we know as well and as Colleen, I think, presented very nicely, it's not that all places that are poor or predominantly rural have high rates of child marriage for either boys or girls. So there's clearly something that's going on beyond or behind the scenes that might be shaping outcomes in specific regions or in a country or regions within a country. So in thinking about looking at what drives early marriage for boys, we looked at data from 59 lower middle income countries gathered from between 2003 and 2019, and I'll spare the details. You can see that more in the paper that is shared. Looking specifically at trying to understand some of these factors that are associated with higher rates of marriage before 18 among boys. And our broad hypothesis, and this is also somewhat of a conclusion, is that really, as with girls, gender norms are playing a key factor in shaping early marriage rates for boys, particularly those that are more related to marriage and sexual behavior and expectations around those behaviors. So I think in thinking about this, the work of Equimundo researchers is really important. In particular, the work around the man box, which is really about this social expectations for manhood that in some ways box boys and men into certain sets of behaviors, whether they would personally prefer those or not. There's a great deal of social pressure and expectation around those. Common ones that extend across different contexts include things as, the man as the provider, the man as the economic generator within a family, the man as the self-sufficient and independent individual. Those definitions of manhood are quite common across different contexts and have, I think, some very significant implications for marriage patterns and early marriage among boys. So we know as well that in most, perhaps, I think almost all contexts, marriage is really seen as a key marker, or at least union formation, as a key marker of this transition to adulthood. And so in order to be seen as ready to make that transition or ready to marry or take the step towards adulthood, men and boys typically often have to be able to demonstrate that they are ready in the sense that they are economically self-sufficient, they can support a family, they're no longer in school, they're employed, those type of factors. Once they're seen as being ready, they can face a great deal of social pressure to complete that transition to adulthood through marrying and forming their own families. In other words, once the boys have ticked off the right boxes, they're economically independent, they have regular employment, maybe they're living alone, they're then expected to marry. So given this, we might expect that in places where many boys are not in school, are employed, etc., we might find higher proportions married at younger ages. So we looked at this broadly speaking across a range of countries and do find a general association where boys are often quite a bit more likely to be married by age 18 in places where they have checked these readiness to marry boxes, where more boys are out of school, where less boys are transitioning to secondary school, where youth employment is higher. So we argue that the same patriarchal norms that are shaping child marriage for girls are also shaping child marriage for boys through defining masculinity and femininity and the expectations around those. But rather than being focused more on the regulation of sexual and reproductive behaviors in the case often for girls, these for boys appear to be mainly driven by the norms that create social pressure to marry as soon as boys are ready, as soon as they're economically independent and are seen as being able to support a family. So in contexts where poverty, economic opportunities, limited returns to education, or other forms of other pathways to adulthood are possible, this will drive boys out of school and into the labor force, and therefore then potentially creating a larger pool of boys who are seen as ready and are facing considerable social pressure then to marry. And we also know, I think, as Colleen pointed out very nicely, that this sets boys and their partners on really early formation, family formation pathways that are more likely to result in earlier childbearing, poverty, and a range of other outcomes that matter both for the boys themselves as they transition through the rest of their lives and for their families as well. So I'll stop there, but there's a great deal more that you can see in the paper, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. And it's nice to sort of understand the gender dimensions of boys entering child marriages themselves, and some of the factors that drive them. So given what we've heard, given that this is a practice that is happening among young men, that organizations are increasingly trying to pay attention to this, that there are gender dimensions that drive it. What are some of the challenges to addressing this set of issues? It seems so obvious, and there should be a mandate for that calls us to work with boys and men on child marriage. And so, Jose Roberto, I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit to some of the challenges in the field and a combination of sort of what's happening and why isn't there more happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm pleased because working on masculinities is really close to my heart since my activist days. And now working, supporting the global program to end child marriage in 12 countries, but really reaching more than 54 countries. And after going through 10 gender assessments using the gender-transformative accelerator tool, we have observed different trends and patterns. This is not scientific as such, but it's a participatory gender review and assessment. And we have observed that in general, as Julie was saying, based on the evidence review, very often boys are totally overlooked by programs working on child marriage. And most of the programs are really trying to engage men and boys, but really looking at adult men as gatekeepers, as decision makers, as traditional leaders, but not necessarily through programming interventions really addressing the specific needs or like transformative change that should be expected for boys. And based on the evidence that was presented, we know that boys are also affected by child marriage as child groups. The proportion is not that big as girls, but they are also affected. And from a human rights perspective, we should be looking at how we can really engage and address positive masculinities with men and boys through our programming. The second pattern that we have observed is like most of the countries think and programs, they think that they're addressing gender transformative programming. But going and digging deeper, that's not necessarily the case. Even there are countries that can be using exploitative approaches, or in some cases, blind approaches, and unintentionally reinforcing power, especially for adult men as power holders or stakeholders. And most of the countries are really engaging men and boys, but when we are really trying to get the conversation around positive masculinities and what do we mean by transforming power dynamics or redistributing resources for girls and women, the conversation is different, and we are not yet there. The third element is we are still observing this dichotomy between investing in girls or investing, for example, in programming working with boys. And I have to say that this dichotomy really plays in both ways. For example, if you are really talking about adolescent girl-centered programming and making intentional investments in girls, you can get immediately reactions saying, and what about boys? But this reaction is really, like coming from this criticism of investing only in girls, but not necessarily from a gender perspective. And the other way around, if we are working, for example, with boys, the conversation turns into, is this money, really digressing or deviating, for example, the investment on girls and women? So which means that we are, trapped in this dichotomy and not necessarily analyzing the whole spectrum from a more ecological or socio-ecological perspective. And what should be really trying to do differently? And I would say that as part of the UN system, and not only as UNFPA, because we are observing these challenges together with UNICEF and other UN agencies. First of all, we should be addressing gender transformative approaches in our programming with boys and men, but really using an intentional approach. It shouldn't be by chance. We also need to be more systematic, and that means that we shouldn't be taking things, for granted. Working with boys through youth programming or CSC could be addressing masculinities, or maybe not. So we really need to be systematic and intentional, but we also need to look for sustained investments. We also need to be strategic, and I'm so happy because we are having this conversation, because we really need to start early in childhood and in early adolescence. We are always looking at the issues, but not necessarily the prevention measures we have. And we have evidence. If you look at the chat or even the questions, you can see that there is evidence about how neuroscience has been telling us, what are the early ages for really investing in this idea of creating a sense of equality. We really need to overcome this dichotomy, women versus men or girls versus boys. We really need to integrate gender synchronous approaches or recover that sense of gender synchronicity. We also need to look at the quality, the evidence, and the standards, because that's another challenge and issue. We don't know exactly what's the content that the programs are really addressing when working with men and boys. Not all the programs are following curriculums or evidence-based curriculums. And this is a challenge that we also observe, for example, on CSC or other areas. And the final one, we really need to also be responsive and targeted, addressing the internal biases of the staff, of the people that are working through these programs, because even when we are working on these topics, we have seen that we are reinforcing gender stereotyping. And finally, I'm so happy that we have now this evidence review that we published together with Equimundo that is really talking about what are the minimum topics that we should be discussing. How are we going to talk about sexual consent? Are we going to intentionally talking about sexual violence? Are we going to talk about also freedom, happiness for their own sake, for their own well-being? How we can recover this more humanistic approach in what we do? Because, for example, all this conversation about toxic masculinities, what's the effect in boys? There is a lot to discuss about. But these are the main elements that we have observed. And as I said, we have seen this through the implementation of the Gender Transformative Accelerator tool in 10 countries so far. And this is coming up and coming up and coming up. So I'm happy to discuss further. Thank you, Meg.
Thank you, Jose Roberto, and thank you for setting a good example that I hope our other speakers will also take forward, which is if you could have a chance to glance at the question and answer boxes, it'll give you a sense of how the participants are, some of the questions that they're raising, and there might be some particular topics that you could respond to in your follow-up remarks. So I'm especially intrigued by your term trapped in a dichotomy, Jose Roberto, which I feel like is a sort of metaphor for very early marriage also. I have to think about how to, what that means, how we could work with that concept. So what I'd like to do now is we'll go back and request that the speakers respond to some of the questions that are in the Q&A boxes, but also just sort of have a chance to speak a little bit further now that we've really seen the landscape from a sort of field programmatic partnership perspective. And so, Colleen, I'd like to start with you and ask you about what you see as important gaps in the data, and that, particularly gaps that might inform the kinds of interventions that could be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a handful of reflections. I want to, I think, speak about it in two streams. First, I have a couple of personal reflections just based on the work and the data analysis that we've done before. A couple of things that really emerge in my mind as kind of unanswered questions in a way. And one of these is that, so we have, I think, a decent idea of what it means for girls to take on the role of a wife, right? When they're in childhood, we know that usually it means that they stop going to school, they have household responsibilities, they, have pregnancies, they spend their time raising children. What I don't know that we have a great sense of at the moment is, what does it mean for boys to take on the role of a husband when they are in childhood? So we have, I think, some ideas about what this could mean, and I think Jeff spoke to these about the kind of readiness for manhood and how these are also kind of constructed by norms about manhood and what it means to be ready. And I think similarly, on the kind of downstream, what that could look like, some of the ideas we might think that this could result in are that boys might be experiencing like financial pressures to provide for a family. They might lose opportunities to advance education and pursue decent work opportunities, but I don't know that this has fully been explored. And so that's something that I'd love to see more research on. The other thing that really raises to the forefront in my mind is, what does it mean for couples when both partners are children? So I think that type of partnership is something that we really could learn a lot more about. So what's the impact on the relationship between the two of them? What's the impact on their experiences of parenthood, on that couple's place in their society? So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions there. Something that, we thought about exploring a bit was, even when we think about child marriage among girls, we often focus on those that have the partnerships that have big age disparities, right? And the risk inherent for girls in being in a partnership where they're much younger than their partner. But is it, better for them in an equity sense in their relationship to be with a peer or not? So there's I think we did a bit of analysis, but I think it's still a bit unanswered in our minds about really what does that look like. The other thing that I'll speak to is just, and I think Jose Roberto has already alluded to a fair amount about the work that the UNFPA and UNICEF Global Program on child marriage has done. But there are some points I think that came up in the evidence review that was done relatively recently that speak to some gaps and some needs in the evidence. So I think that the stats that I have on hand here is that of the 386 studies that were identified as relevant in their evidence review, only 18 of them had a focus on boys. And of those that had a focus on boys, they were mainly focused on masculinities and how ideas of manhood drove child marriage for girls. So it was definitely identified as a gap, and so that emerged, I think, in the some of the priority research areas and research questions that are identified in this global research strategy that emerged from that. So in terms of looking at specific boys as a specific risk group that's not well understood for child marriage, and then some research questions on how adolescent boys experience child marriage and how they negotiate gender norms. So just to say, these are identified as some of the research priorities in the global research strategy. And so there are efforts that are now underway to strengthen the evidence base with an eye towards answering those questions. I'll wrap up there for the moment. Thank you.
That's great. And I appreciate how you directed your sort of diagnosis of the gaps very much toward the kinds of things we should be thinking about in developing interventions. Julie, I'd like to turn to you next and ask you, given your review of the evidence of what is out there now, are there particular recommendations that stand out to you for gender transformative programming? And obviously also please feel free to respond to the question in light of the other things that people have been speaking about today.
Sure, thanks, Meg. I'll just, I think it will be useful probably for people to run quickly through just the main recommendations from the report, if that's okay. So I'll just share my screen again to do that. There you go. So I think the first one of the recommendations from the review was to establish gender synchronized engagement of boys as a core component of the program. So I think it's so much resonance with other points that have been made, especially pretty much everything that Jose Roberto pointed out, with one of the key messages being around the engagement of boys and men being essential to transform the social norms around gender, sexuality, family formation at play in child marriage. But I would add, after hearing from colleagues' presentations today, transforming the norm at play, both for the majority of child marriages, that is child marriage of girls, but also among the minority of child marriages among boys, but still too often, and that came very strongly from our review, this component is still considered as a bit of an afterthought. So I think the strongest message from this review for me was really to do a shift of mindset to make it a really core component of interventions on child marriage, and having this gender synchronized interventions that really grant the same level of attention in tailoring content to both boys and girls, and of course all the actors that make this possible. So the report includes lots of references to specific curriculum that are designed for male engagement. Number two was setting up partnership to work at all levels of the social ecological model, with particular attention to institutional change. So I'm sorry if there's some repetition with the findings, just because the recommendation very much build on the findings, obviously, but as I highlighted before, this was a major gap, so there's more needed there. And there was, because it was a gap, there was not so many resources that we could identify as part of this review that were focusing on boys' engagement, but there are some useful resources for institutional level work to address child marriage and I think, was it this? There's this UNFPA note on gender equitable systems, for example. We also list a lot of resources developed by Girls Not Brides around budget advocacy, working with parliamentarians, with religious leaders, or the media, all very important for that level of work. Then we had a point around, again, this really need for deep long-term engagement at multiple level. I'm not going to repeat too much because I think it's very linked to the previous points. Deep understanding of adolescent boys' profiles and tailoring program to them, very much linked to number one of the recommendations, obviously. And I think, again, you know, like any solid program that should be based on a deep understanding of participants and their environment and the issues. So gender transformative programming for boys, or no exceptions. I think I liked an example from the review that was NISI 2 program in Kenya with a Pop Council, which looked at, I saw that there was a question in the chat box about poverty, and I just wanted to use that example to show that in that context in Kenya, they really stressed the poverty content was a major concern in the local communities, and acknowledging the pressure, gender pressure put on boys and men to be the provider in the family. So what they chose to do was to include the gender transformative component into a broader economic empowerment and life skills for boys. But again, echoing some of the colleagues' points, when doing that, we also need to be very careful about considering how to not reinforce some of the pressures that are put on various gender-based. Under the tailoring, I think some of those resources have been mentioned already. Then one of that's probably the second that stands out more for me is the point around sexuality. Well, key message here is this is a must, and not only to address with adolescents, but really at all level, and again, going beyond family planning and bodily changes, etc., to really deep dive into all the notions around purity, virginity. And there are 4 particular resources that are highlighted in the report. I'm not going to mention them all just for the sake of time, but really invite you to have a look. And I've seen that Jean, I think, or Caroline posted in the chat the link to the Tackling the Taboo report as well, which has lots of resources on this. This point around challenging the status quo through gender transformative staff training and program design. Again, this was a point very much made by Jose Roberto, so I'm not going to insist too much, but I think one example as well that I found was adding to this was in terms of program design, just making clear that one thing that came out from the review was also, we talked a lot about reflection and introspection, but one point that I didn't mention earlier was also the importance of going kind of back and forth between reflection, but also practice, and showing concrete examples of change and then going back to reflection. So, for example, some of the programs that we reviewed, they put a lot of emphasis on the importance of showing to boys in sessions that to have like a pair of facilitators that were male and female to put the kind of equality lens in practice, or prioritizing a mixture of single and mixed sex groups over just single sex groups when it's possible. And then I've just got 2 points left, one on building the evidence around boys' engagement. I think we stressed it a lot. This is scarce, so it will help continuing assessing impact and identify some greater consensus on what works. And obviously, the last recommendation was a call for domestic and international investment to help fill some of the gaps really with the I think most of the gaps we've highlighted before around evaluation, institutional level work. I think there's one additional one probably around geographical coverage of interventions. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but in our review, most of the program that came up were focused on Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, probably in line with existing evidence and some of our criteria, which included some limitations around language, but I'm sure that there can be more evidence coming out of other regions and context as well, including evidence around child marriages of boys. I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, just seeing lots of themes, threads crossing between different remarks that people are making. Jean, I'd like to ask you now, in light of the work that's going on, what do you see as some kind of sort of promising programmatic areas? And would you say that this work, this attention to boys and child marriage is influencing the way that Girls Not Brides is thinking about its work with girls at all?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Meg. I actually shared a few slides which might be just helpful to throw up for the discussion. I think, yes, it starts there. Yeah, so just across thinking, so just to flag as well, the CRANK is a joint initiative, Girls Not Brides, and also UNFPA, UNICEF Global Program to End Child Marriage. What we have seen since we started the calls, I think it was March in 2021, we've done quite a number of calls focusing on priority research topics around the field of child marriage. And what we have seen is increasingly this thread coming up of the need to do more work around social norms and working with boys and men to transform social norms and promote gender equality. You can pop onto the next slide there, please. So the other thing that we have done recently as part of the CRANK network is we looked at the evidence on promising practice from 2020 to 2021, looking at prevention interventions to prevent child marriage and also to support married girls. And I'll just pick up a couple of things here that are interesting, not to circle back on what's already been said before. But just I think one of the things that we pulled out here, it's something that we talk about that we know, but it was something that we really wanted to underscore in our work, is that although we know that efforts to shift harmful and restrictive norms are likely to be limited, that they are likely to be limited if they're not matched with corresponding supply side interventions to allow for the behavior change. For example, the use of contraception without accompanying availability of contraception. And looking at the emerging practice, I'll draw down on two examples that are interesting. One I want to pull out because it kind of looks at social norm change in the humanitarian area. So the first is SAGE program, which was implemented in Northeast Nigeria in 2020, and this demonstrates the potential of taking a whole family approach to shifting attitudes around adolescent girls' agency and the acceptability of violence at the household. And through addressing whole family units with gender transformative curricula, SAGE reported shifts towards more egalitarian family relationships, decreased violence perpetration, and acceptability of violence. And then this next example, the HEY program from Honduras, which I think is very relevant given the discussions we've had around curricula and participatory-based education approach. This program demonstrates that implementing comprehensive sexuality education curricula showed really promising results in reducing child marriage and teenage pregnancy. And it also led to the local government expressing interest to integrate the HEY curriculum in urban secondary schools, which is very positive. And then kind of circling back on what we need to know more of, and this aligns with some of what Colleen and Jose Roberto says as well, it's really thinking about transforming the discriminatory social norms across the life course. So, you know, at those key life stages, and as well informed by better understanding, contextual understanding of privilege and power. And I think Julie just brought this up as well, but critically, we need more emphasis on girls' sexuality across program and research, which we know, of course, is a powerful driver of child marriage. Yet it's often ignored in programming. And just moving on to the last slide. So here it's just some of the key messages that we're kind of engaging with members on. And firstly, engaging men and boys, as we know, is a key focus within households, whole household or community approaches. Importantly, informed by this contextual understanding of privilege and power, is indeed very important for shifting harmful norms and sustaining behavioural change over the longer term. And secondly, engaging with restrictive gendered norms and power dynamics as part of the delivery of comprehensive sexual education to both girls and boys can help to address the stigma and shame that exists around adolescents, girls' sexuality, and improve access to SRHR. And there's long-standing evidence that sustained CSE that includes a focus on gender and power is 5 times more likely to improve gender equality and sexual health-related outcomes for young people. And 3, solutions need to be holistic. I think everybody's been talking about this as well. We need to work across sectors and at scale because everything is connected to everything. And so for this, we really kind of are promoting an increased focus on working across, you know, education, livelihood, sexual and reproductive health, rights and employment as important areas to build the economic and political agency of girls and catalyze norm change at scale. And finally, then this relates back to Jose Roberto talking more about putting more attention on the gender synchronicity, which we just talk about taking care that these efforts are done in a synchronized way and they don't decenter or sideline girls, women's voices, opinions, or leadership. So I hope that is a bit of a run through some of the key findings from the latest evidence and what we're discussing with members.
Thank you, Jean. Now, I'd like to point out that we have 15 minutes left in the webinar, and I'm seeing 22 people have, added their questions to the Q&A, and I do think it's maddening to participate in a webinar where you don't get a chance to speak. So I do want to give Jose Roberto and Jeff a moment to respond, but if you can, and I have there were specific points that I think would be wonderful if you could touch on, but if you could be extremely brief so that we do have a final 10 minutes or so for questions from the participants. So Jose Roberto, if you could say a little bit about how the UN system can reinforce an initiative like CRANK that Jean spoke about, and other sort of key elements of the path ahead.
Thank you, Meg. And I also would like to touch upon certain questions that are there. For example, before coming, and going to the CRANK, I think it's important to keep the reflection that child marriage has a lot to do with sexuality. And that means that we cannot talk about ending child marriage or engaging boys in the elimination of child marriage or responding to child marriage, which is affecting boys, without addressing sexuality, power, and redistribution of resources. If we, for example, review Equimundo's paper of, like in the case of Brazil, honor is there. How we can explain this high number that Colleen was, presenting about child marriage among boys in Latin America? Are we talking about forced marriage because of an adolescent pregnancy? It's just, like a correlation that we will need to look at in terms of, the higher prevalence of also adolescent pregnancy. And then moving back to the CRANK, I would say that partnerships, like UNFPA, UNICEF, the whole UN system needs to work in partnership to really accelerate progress, to really make changes. And that is also not only about really moving a development agenda forward, is for not reinventing the wheel. How we can really use the resources that are available, the publications, the evidence, and this conversation, particularly about crank. We can have the best evidence available, but if practitioners, if countries, if organizations, if programmers are not using the evidence, we are exactly in the middle of the way, going nowhere. So the crank is critical because it's really helping us to really translate the evidence into a very accessible channel where practitioners, civil society organizations, academics can really have a conversation and put the evidence into practice. But for example, we are also working with the STAR initiative with Innocenti, also reviewing how the evidence could be, like of more quality. We are addressing these gender reviews through the accelerator tool. We are also working with partners like Equimundo for having this evidence review. How we collectively can support movement building, utilization and uptake of the evidence for really transforming what we are doing, especially in times where pushback is there, where counter movements are contesting even the minor or innocent conversations about gender equality, and how we can use the resources in a best way and more effective manner. Over to you, Meg.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to go right to Jeff and ask you if given your research on the gender-related factors driving boys into early marriages, do you have some particular thoughts about what can be done to address those challenges?
Yes, so I think fortunately a lot of what can be done are similar to what we might do for girls in preventing child marriage. Working, I think, continually to work on the structural drivers will make a difference. I think particularly though, understanding what, that those drivers are not exactly the same for girls and for boys. And so focusing perhaps on issues around keeping boys in school for longer, eliminating child labor, reviewing those kind of things, keeping boys from engaging in that particular pathway to adolescence would be a great step forward. And let's remember that increasingly at the global level, we're seeing a disadvantage for boys in educational attainment. And what does that mean? What are these boys doing if they're not in school? What does that mean for family formation? Those are things that I think are important in terms of thinking about the outcomes for boys in many different ways, but this is one. But more fundamentally, I think the same things that we've all been talking about here is really transforming social norms through programming and policy, working to enhance pathways to adulthood that don't necessarily include marriage as such a critical component of that. And we know that having children and being married is critically important for women's passage to adulthood in many places, but it's also very much tied to men's achievement of social status and other things that we can't ignore that either. And I think also just generally as a field, understanding that many young boys are feeling pressured or forced into early marriages. We don't typically think of it that way because of the types of power imbalances that Jose Roberto is talking about. And we can't ignore the fact that early marriage is just much less prevalent and potentially much less impactful for boys than it is for girls. And I think we shouldn't overstate also not understated. And certainly right now, programming is just not focusing on trying to understand that. Along those lines, I think we should assume that the same interventions that we've used and developed for girls over the past 20 or 30 years will work for boys. We need to understand what's going on and program around those differences. And I think more to Jose Roberto's point as well is developing and implementing gender transformative programming for boys and men that's based on their needs and the consequences for their lives, and not solely as instruments for improving outcomes for girls. We will, I think, inevitably be improving outcome for girls and women through gender transformative programming that works with boys and men. but so much of that programming isn't intended really at its core to improve the lives of boys and men. And I think that's a major problem and a step that we need to think about as a field.
Great. Now, in the program that we developed for today's webinar, I was meant to summarize some key points, but I think I will basically get out of the way. I did want to mention that one of the things that stands out for me is that we really don't have high quality evidence. With the exception of, Jeff and I have been involved in some research using the database that Greenworks has developed that runs from 2000 to 2022 in 4 languages, and basically sort of all of the research evidence on child marriage. And we've just conducted an analysis of programs that aim to shift norms, and in that sense, to contribute to preventing child marriage. So overall, the evidence is very weak, and I'm hearing there are fantastic ideas out there that need to be tested. And I think building some strong evaluations will be very important. Now, I would just like to step aside and I hope maybe Caroline, you would be able to say something about the questions which have been answered, which have not, et cetera.
Thank you, Meg. Appreciate it. So I know that many folks in the chat are asking for the presentations from our panelists. So if our panelists are willing, if you could add those as attachments in the chat or just message me that you would be okay with me sharing those, that would be great. And I'm happy to do that. Secondly, I know our panelists have already responded to many of the questions already answered in the chat, but as we go through the next 5 or so minutes, if you could respond to any other ones as able, that would be great. So thank you for doing that to some of those beforehand, but I'll just pull a couple of the questions that were asked in the chat in ways that haven't been addressed quite yet. One of those is a question on the religious factors in the child marriage of boys and whether or not it contributes to differences across the regions that you all have seen. So if anyone would like to take that question first, that would be great. And then the other question that I will pull is about the need for gender synchronization, saying that many have been advocating for this approach for a long time, and there are many barriers, challenges, and resistance to this approach. So what advice do any of you have for taking this work forward and also expanding it? And so I will highlight those 2 questions here and then leave a few minutes for Meg and Gary to give some closing remarks. I know that we all are trying to hop off as soon as possible. So I will leave it there for our panelists. Thank you.
Perhaps I could speak to the question on religious factors and differences across regions. The research on child marriage among girls, I think, establishes pretty clearly that it's not so much religious beliefs as a broader kind of cultural belief. And I think that those things sometimes are intertwined and sometimes they're not. So when we look at the global level, there isn't as strong a link as you might think in driving these differences. I personally would say that the clearer link between religion and child marriage has to do with how religion in particular, or religious traditions in particular contexts, deal with questions around sexuality and control of sexuality, particularly women's sexuality, but obviously, those of boys as well. So I would just, I think that at the global level, the evidence isn't particularly strong of any great link between individual religious traditions and child marriage, but certainly the influence, I think, flows through control of sexuality and sexual behavior and implications for reproduction and so on.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for addressing that. The second question was on the gender synchronization efforts and what advice anyone here has for taking that work forward and expanding it.
I can jump in and share some insights if that's useful, just drawing on some experience from, I think it was this Plan International have done some work around this with Champions of Change and other girl-centered approaches. And I think we've also seen in Girls Not Brides in the region in India, we've seen a lot of successful work around this gender synchronization in the field of sports. So we are seeing some kind of increasingly promising engagement and pathways there, just to add that.
Great, thanks, Jean. I think with that, I'll toss it over to Meg and Gary for some closing remarks. And thank you all.
Meg, would you like to start? And then I'll jump in with a couple of just 2 minutes at the end.
Sure. I don't want to say very much because I just think that the presentations were wonderful. I think that they gave us this picture of, you know, the data, the patterns, the gaps, the drivers, you know, some of the programmatic responses, the kinds of, you know, role that different partners are playing, et cetera. So I've learned so much today, and I think this is a wonderful inaugural webinar for the Global Boyhood Initiative, and I wish we had another hour because I guess there's lots and lots of good ideas that have come up today, and I've been scribbling notes frantically. So thank you all so much. I'm sorry our time was short, but I'm going to hand it off to Gary and look forward to being in touch. Thank you.
Meg, thanks so much for facilitating this and for your leadership on the research as well. And thanks to all the panelists for this. Just maybe add a couple of final reflections on the gender synchronous, which is to remember that we also mean relational as part of that. And I guess both the relationships between girls and boys, but also the relationship between parents, the relationship between male caregivers and female caregivers, and between parents and young people. And I think we know that in the field of adolescent sexual and reproductive health and rights, just how much a parental relationship with young people matters in terms of healthy sexuality. And we know how much it matters in child marriage in terms of decision-making and agency to be able to push back. So just how much, I think we're looking a lot in the field at either 2-generation programs that both engage young people directly as well as engaging parents, but that even as we think about the power of parent training, to acknowledge how much it is important that we're engaging both parents when we're talking about heterosexual households, of course. So just, to call out that we need to think about boys in relationships. So it's gender synchronous, but also just understand how much we must support boys and girls with healthy relationship skills and the possibility, the agency to act on those. So really thrilled to see how much the gender synchronous model came out, but to remember that we're talking a lot about relationships, and mindful as well that our images research, our international men and gender equality research, finds that of factors that lead men and boys to have more gender equitable views, including in their intimate partner relationships, is how much they saw gender equality in their caregivers growing up. And for girls, we know how much it also pays ahead that they witness gender equality in the relationships of their parents or caregivers as well. So I bring that part in there of kind of how much we bring parents in a gender transformational and a gender relational aspect in there. Just to call attention to the upcoming webinars, and I think Caroline just posted there, April 5th, very relevant to this, and Jeff mentioned, is what's happening in boys' education around the world. We'll be doing the second webinar in the series together with UNESCO, World Bank, Room to Read, and UNGAI, looking at what we know about global data on boys' education and why it matters so much for this topic, but on boys and gender equality in general. And then our next one coming up, we've not set the date for it, is around boys and pornography, and also very related to this theme on boys and sexuality, and looking at it from a lens of how do we have conversations about healthy sexuality with boys, thinking about what we know with emerging research on how much boys and girls are accessing pornographic material online. So I want to thank everybody involved in that. Stay tuned for more emails around that. And with that, we will sign off. I want to thank Caroline and our team who have supported, Hannah from our comms team, and all of our team from Equimundo who have supported on this. Thanks all for joining, and we hope to be involved with you in conversations in the next webinars.